Well, we are in our home run life series again today, and I'm really excited to be continuing this series with you. And I don't know about you folks, but some of my favorite memories in life, some of my most treasured memories in life have involved those closest to me. Okay? Our best life experiences oftentimes involve other people, correct? Yeah, so the picture you will see on the screen is a picture of me and my wife on the day we were married. Oh, yeah, I know. That was June 28th, 1998. And in 2 weeks, it will be 25 years. Can you believe she's put up with me that long? Yes, sir. Wow. That's pretty awesome, guys. Thanks for modeling that before us. You know, I still remember, I bet Floyd and Winifred remember the day. I still remember the day. I remember all the things about it. I remember my beautiful bride walking down the aisle to my brother-in-law, Caleb, who was about 12 at the time, and he was trying to play the bridal march on the trumpet, and it didn't come out sounding like anything like the bridal march. I remember that day, the only highway, we got married at a little chapel in Daniel Boone National Forest in Kentucky. And I remember that day, the only road leading into that place had a car accident, closed down the highway for several hours. Consequently, most of our guests never made it to our wedding. So, don't feel bad. We still got the gifts later. It was good. But seriously, I remember that day because it was the hottest and most humid day that Kentucky had had in a summer for a long time, which made wearing a tuxedo feel like a personal sauna, right? You know, and but it didn't really matter because I had my bride, and it was the first day of the rest of our lives together. And not too long after our wedding, we attended the wedding of some friends that we had at Northwest Nazarene University, and I was actually asked to sing in that wedding. And so we traveled from Nampa, Idaho to Leavenworth, Washington. And it's one of those memories. You ever have one of those memories where at the time it was not funny, but now, looking back, you can laugh? Well, that was one of those memories because of what went wrong. Not the wedding. The wedding went fine. But the 7-hour trip from Leavenworth, Washington back to Nampa, that's where things went wrong. Now, you have to understand the majority of the trip from Nampa, Idaho to Leavenworth, Washington is made across some pretty arid territory. It's hot, it's dry, and the temperatures get well over 100 degrees during the summer while we were traveling. And as we were coming home, as the temperature outside was going up, guess what? The temperature gauge in my car was going up too. And then, to make a long story short, Xandra and I ended up on the side of the road and eventually in a village. Yes, I said a village, not a town. It's kind of like Virginia. If you head out on, out of town, you get to Virginia. That's about the size of the place that we stopped. And we asked there was a gas station. And so we walked in and I asked if there was a mechanic. And the gal at the counter said, well, if you go a couple of houses down and knock on the door, I think you'll find somebody. And of course, we were young and I didn't know any better. And so I just waltzed up to the door and I knocked on the door. And a very large and gruff woman came to the door. And I asked her, is there a mechanic here in the house? And she barked back at her husband who was in the back room trying to sleep. And she barked louder than any mean dog I've ever been around. And so I basically said to her, you know what? I think we'll try something different. Thank you. But I think every one of my best life experiences have involved other people. But if I'm honest, I don't think it's an overstatement to say that my life's lowest moments have also involved other people. You see, from harsh words to hurt feelings to betrayal, divorce, estrangement, even death, relationships have the potential to bring as much sorrow to our lives as they do happiness. And one of the more defining discoveries that I've made in my life has to do with the very simple realities regarding this. Perhaps you have learned this as much as I have, that people carry a degree of brokenness with them in their lives. Hurting people have a funny way of hurting people. And people who are in pain, they painfully lash out at other people. Have you discovered that? I know I have. It seems to be a truism that makes its application in just about every realm out there. You know, leadership would be easy if it weren't for the people. Other places of work would be far easier to navigate if it weren't for the people. Family life would be much simpler if it weren't for the other people. And life itself, it seemed, would be much easier, right? If everyone would just leave me alone, right? Why are relationships so hard? Because the vast majority of us are broken people in need of healing. See, everyone has hurts and wounds and pain that we've had to deal with in life, and we all bring that into our relationships with others, regardless of the environment. And once we brush up against each other, oftentimes we feel the sting of that pain, right? In many ways, our predicament's kind of like the experience that we've all had. Have you ever gotten a splinter before? It's kind of like that, right? I mean, now, if you're wise, if you get a splinter, the first thing you're going to do is you're going to try and get it out immediately. You're not going to do what I did when I was a kid and wait. You see, I don't remember how it happened, but I got a pretty bad splinter in my finger. And then I was told, you need to go to your mom and have her get that splinter out. I said, I'll be fine. I just wanted to keep playing, right? It's going to come out on its own, right? Well, you can imagine what happened. The splinter didn't come out. My finger got infected. It got red and tender, and whenever I walked by the table, I brushed against it really gently, and ow! Right? And so Mom came in, and she took a seat, and she said, sit next to me. And it's amazing. Moms just know how to do this, right? Suddenly, Mom transformed into a surgeon, and she began digging out that splinter, and now everything was so sensitive that it was excruciating, right? Was that my mom's fault that it hurt to get it out? No. But it still hurt. And you know, it's a pretty similar experience to what happens in our relationships. From marriage to family to work to church, people have neglected to treat their emotional wounds, and it causes all sorts of issues in our relationships in life. True? So here's the truth. Time, believe it or not, does not heal all wounds. When emotional pain is left untreated, it descends into dysfunction, and dysfunction left untreated itself can actually cause generational curses. And if you don't believe that, just ask Jacob. I want you to take a moment. I want you to think of the most dysfunctional family that you have ever come across in your life. I guarantee you there would be no comparison between them and Jacob's family that we find in the scriptures. And if you're like me, a lot of times when you think of biblical figures, you tend to focus on the highlights of their lives. And Jacob, he had several. There was that whole incident recorded in Genesis 28 where Jacob encountered the Lord in a dream, and then he was given the promise of the Lord's blessing. And then there was, in Genesis 32, we discovered that Jacob, he wrestled with God and he lived. I wouldn't want to wrestle with that guy. But seriously, he wrestled with God and he lived. And not only that, but God blessed him and changed his name. Those are the stories we teach our kids in Sunday school. What we oftentimes forget, though, is that there's another side to Jacob's story. It's not so pretty. In Genesis 25, 28 through 34, we discover that Jacob, his first step toward getting ahead in life, it came from manipulating his brother Esau so that Jacob could have his birthright. And then later in the story, in Genesis 27, Jacob and his mother Rachel, they actually conspired together to deceive Isaac, his dad, Rachel's husband, so that Jacob could receive the firstborn blessing. Now, as I told the kids, Esau wasn't too happy about that. And in Genesis 27, verses 41 through 45, we discover that Esau was nursing a grudge so much that he had in mind that he was going to kill Jacob. And Jacob, well, in response to that, he ended up leaving, right? He ran away. He began to live with his uncle Laban, who would end up deceiving Jacob into receiving a wife that he didn't want. And then he'd have to work 14 years for the wife he did want. I don't know about you, but that does not sound like a peaceful and functional family, right? Jacob's life in the land of his uncle Laban, well, friends, it wasn't exactly a life lived on the highest plane of integrity. In Genesis 30, we find that Jacob lived with sister wives who both eventually gave him their handmaids as wives to bear additional children for him. Jacob ended up having 12 kids from 4 different women who were constantly in competition with each other, and that competition was something they passed down to their kids. Then the sibling rivalry between these 12 boys was so bad, it prompted them to sell one of them, Joseph, the son that Jacob was on record liking the most. They sold him into slavery. Friends, this is just the 30,000-foot overview. I really would encourage you to read Genesis 25 through 50 and get into the story. Because, you see, this is a story of a dysfunctional family, but it doesn't end dysfunctional. And the question I find myself wrestling with about this whole story is, where was Jacob while his wives and his kids were creating all of this chaos? Where was he at? Well, mostly he was working. You see, Jacob, as we've been discovering in this series, he was the classic third base runner. It was all about getting results. He spent the majority of his time working hard, building up his flocks, and becoming really wealthy. In fact, Genesis chapter 30, verse 43 shares the following. In this way, the man, meaning Jacob, grew exceedingly prosperous and came to own large flocks and female and male servants and camels and donkeys. And so as you continue on in Jacob's story, you discover that he amassed just about every material thing that a guy needed to be happy in the time that he lived. He had large flocks, he had large wealth, he had numerous kids and grandkids. Life was perfect, right? But in spite of all those things, if you look beneath the surface of the external success, Jacob wasn't content. Why? Because his family relationships were so badly broken. See, I find it very telling that the formula for worldly success was not greater than the pain of the loss of relationships in Jacob's life. Here's how Jacob responded when his sons led him to believe that Joseph was dead. This is from Genesis 37, 34, and 35. Then Jacob tore his clothes, put on sackcloth, and mourned for his son many days. All his sons and daughters came to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted. No, he said, I will continue to mourn until I join my son in the grave. So his father wept for him. See, on that day, not a single bit of his wealth or success or even the attempts of others who cared for him to comfort him would help. And in fact, even 20 years later, Jacob is still feeling the effects of the loss of Joseph, and so too were Joseph's brothers. You see, when Jacob's boys were sent to Egypt, to buy food, and they unknowingly discovered Joseph. Joseph discovers them and places a little bit of tension in their life at that moment. The first thing that comes out of their mouths is this: surely we are being punished because of our brother. We saw how distressed he was when he pleaded with us for his life, but we would not listen. That's why this distress has come on us. Reuben replied, didn't I tell you not to sin against the boy? But you wouldn't listen. Now we must give an accounting for his blood. Loved ones, time had not healed all wounds. In reality, what had happened, it became an elephant in the room. And it kept them from a closer and more intimate and loving relationship with each other and their father. I mean, every day of their lives, they must have thought about what they had done. And I imagine that the weight of Jacob's dysfunctional relationships and loss, it was always ready to break through the surface, as it did on the day when his sons came back from Egypt without Simeon. This is what he says. Their father Jacob said to them, you have deprived me of my children. Joseph is no more and Simeon is no more, and now you want to take Benjamin. Everything is against me. Well, by now you might be wondering, what in the world, what possible lesson could God try and help us come to understand from a story of such a dysfunctional family? Well, I believe that God would help us understand that if we don't get our second base relationships right, our lives are going to be full of chaos and sorrow. You see, it was only after Joseph and his brothers talked about what had happened that forgiveness was given. It was only after they saw things from God's perspective that their family was able to heal. And herein lies the challenge for all of us, loved ones. If you're like many people, if you're like me, it just feels easier to leave things unaddressed. Just to go about life as if nothing ever happened. And you see, I think that Jacob and his sons discovered a very real truth in their lives. Leaving relational problems unresolved is like living every day with an elephant in the room. True? And oftentimes in life, what happens is that someone in our circles of influence is physically or emotionally or verbally abusive. They get into trouble with drugs, or they become an alcoholic, or they hoard, or they steal, or they spend exorbitant amounts of money that they don't have, or they do something else that's self-destructive or destructive to others, and the people who are closest to them ignore the problem and they just hope it'll go away. But it doesn't. And if someone outside of the dysfunction points out the elephant in the room, the people on the inside say, what elephant? What elephant are you talking about? I don't see no elephant. I don't see a pink elephant. I don't see a blue elephant. I don't see a gray elephant. There's no elephants in here. Everything's fine. But at the core, it's not. And their relationships suffer because of it. And loved ones, a hallmark of healthy relationships is found in our ability to talk about the elephants in the room, to work through the dysfunction with truth and love. Interestingly enough, it's usually the person or the family who's willing to confess that they're not okay. They're the ones who typically work through the stuff and find healing and stability. And interestingly enough, that's how Jacob's family finally experienced healing. One person in the family got healthy. One person was willing to talk about the elephant in the room, and that person was Joseph. And slavery in Egypt had taught him humility. It had helped him to learn the value of other people, and it taught him how to serve others. Joseph allowed himself to be broken and to be rebuilt according to God's priorities. You see, he learned how to win at home plate. Then he learned how to win at first base. And then decades later, when he finally got the chance to interact with his family again, he speaks up about the elephant in the room. And here's what he says. Come close to me." When they had done so, he said, "I am your brother Joseph, the one you sold into Egypt. And now do not be distressed, and do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you. For 2 years now there has been famine in the land, and for the next 5 years there will be no plowing and reaping. But God sent me ahead of you to preserve for you a remnant on earth and to save your lives by a great deliverance." You know, it makes me wonder how our lives might change if we were to talk with truth and love about the elephants in the room, so that we could then live with elephant-free relationships. Folks, listen, I know it's not comfortable. I don't do it well. Because if you're like me, you don't like to be vulnerable. We don't like to admit that perhaps we've got a part in a problem. We don't like to admit when we're wrong. Anybody else besides me? We don't like to say, "I'm sorry. I don't want to have to ask for forgiveness." But loved ones, if we're going to win second base, these are the things that we have to do, because an attitude of humility and a willingness to change are essential if we want to win in our relationships with others. Okay, in the time that we've got left, I want to quickly take you through some handles. I want to give you some handles that you can hold on to and help apply to your relationships. And these handles come from applying what we find in the first 2 verses of the book of Ephesians chapter 5. This is what Ephesians 5 verses 1 through 2 say. "Follow God's example, therefore, as dearly loved children, and walk in the way of love, just as Christ loved us and gave himself up for us as a fragrant offering and sacrifice to God." Now, I want us to sit on this just for a second. Follow God's example. We could just stop right there and leave, huh? Follow God's example. Walk in the way of love. This is second base instruction. So how do we do it? Well, I want to give you 3 things that are consistent about God's love so that we can apply it to our relationships. The first thing is this: we need to keep our word. We need to keep our word. Jesus said, "Let your yes be yes and your no be no." God keeps his word. And when God says something, he does it. But the question is, how about you? How about me? The stability of our relationships are founded upon the character of those who are in relationship. And when those people say yes or no, it can be counted on. And this forms a basis of trust in relationships, and trust is essential for any healthy relationship to exist. So this is why we have to win at first base before we can win at second base, loved ones. When trust breaks down, you are thrown out on your way to second. And this is true of just about every segment of life. I think we could probably pay off the national debt with all of the money that has been spent through the years cleaning up after people, after businesses, and after governments who have not kept their word. True? You see, in the end, what happens if we don't keep our word is that marriages and families and businesses and churches and nations collapse. So again, I'm going to ask us all, how are we doing with that? When you give your word, can you be counted on to keep it? Improvement here brings improvement in every area of your life. Number 2, keep your calendar aligned with your relationships. And here's what this means. If you're going to keep your word, you're going to end up having to change your calendar, right? So if you make a commitment to a relationship, you're going to have to change your calendar. And the reason is this: because relationships require time and attention. True? So here's where this gets really practical and really convicting for me. Romans chapter 12, verse 9 says that our love, your love, must be sincere. So if we're going to love like God, then we will need to make time for the ones that we love. If we don't, our love is not sincere. Okay? So here's what this means. We can't say, God, I love you, but I'm just too busy to spend any time with you. God, I love you, but I just, that whole church thing, I just can't do it. God, I love you, but I'm not going to serve. I'm not going to tell other people about you. But God, I love you, right? Do you see the disparity between what we say and what we do? Oh, here's another thing. We can't say to our spouse or our kids or our grandkids, guys, I really love you. But right now, I'm just in a busy season. So, that means I'm not going to be home as much. And what that means is, I'm not going to be able to keep that thing that I promised you, that trip we were going to take. I'm sorry, I'm not going to be able to do that. That outing we were going to do together. I'm sorry, we're going to have to. But you guys, that I love you, right? No, actually, they don't. Like I said, this is really practical and really convicting. And can I let you know I'm preaching to myself here before I ever preach to you? But if we're going to love like God loves, then we're going to have to make time and attention with our loved ones a priority, and that means we have to keep our calendars aligned. True? Come on. Number three. Keep your accounts with other people short. Keep your accounts with other people short. So here's the question we all have to answer in life. What are we going to do with the pain that other people inflict upon us? Are we going to focus on the pain? Are we going to spend our time nursing grudges? And here's some truth we need to hold on to. If we hold on to resentment, then loved ones, it will wreck all of your relationships. If we carry bitterness in our hearts, it will contaminate your spirit. If we choose the path of revenge, it will twist our character and lead us down paths of self-deception. So what do? We release these things to God, and we forgive what we cannot forget. We release these things into God's hands, and we forgive what we cannot forget. Pastor, you don't know the pain. You don't know the hurt that they've caused. No, I don't. You're right, I don't. And I'm not trying to make light of it. But what I've discovered from my own life is that it's really easy for me to demand justice and to forget all of the mercy and the grace and forgiveness that God has shown me. It's really easy for me to look at the speck in my brother's eye while all the time of having a log in my own. And so here's why this is important. People who keep short accounts with other people don't carry around a wounded spirit or a victim mentality. They're not easily offended. They're not quick to lash out. They just trust God, and they just keep adding value to other people, which is just another way of saying they're following God's example and walking in the way of love. So as we bring this message to a close, I want us to think about what the world might be like if we truly began to win at second base. Philippians chapter 2, verses 3 through 4, they give us some world-changing counsel. Paul says, "Do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit. Rather, in humility, value others above yourselves, not looking to your own interests, but each of you to the interests of the others." Can you imagine what our relationships with our spouses and families and friends and churches and communities would look like if we put that into practice? Can you imagine what would happen if we forgave the people who have hurt us the most? Can you imagine how much easier it would be for us to live life and to live with others? Can you imagine what would happen if we went out of our way to give more than we take and to do it from a heart of sincerity? Can you imagine how that would impact our coworkers and our neighbors and those who are skeptical of our common faith in Jesus Christ? What would all of that do? Well, loved ones, I believe it would launch every one of us into a third base result that would bring honor to Christ and would bring good to others and would bless our lives with something far more lasting than worldly success. It would give our lives significance. I want us to pray, and as I pray, I'm going to have my worship team come and join me.